Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Good to see you all. Sorry for the delay. Okay. Hello, Herb, Nicole, Natalie, Joseph, Robert, YouTube, and as well as the people on Facebook who will be on there in one moment. Okay.
Good evening, Rabbi.
Yeah, I'm getting an echo. Let me get rid of it. Bear with me for 1 second, please. There we are. I'm going to make it quiet. Good. There we are. Okay, so before we begin, there's something very important that we need to know about where we are because um, we're about halfway through the book, and we're about halfway through the book, and we're still in sort of the history part of the book, which means to say, other than Nebuchadnezzar's vision, we're still talking about what happens to Daniel. So, a couple important things. A couple important things are happening over here. A couple very important things are happening over here. One is that you'll notice there's a difference between what happens here with Nebuchadnezzar and what happens with Darius and what happens with the Jewish people, say in the times of the Megillah. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar, wanted everyone to bow down to him. The Hanani Mishael Mosiah refused. In the time of Purim, of course, as we've discussed, the Jews were threatened with annihilation because they were Jews. Here, with Darius, the king of Persia, it's different. He has no particular animus towards the Jews. Indeed, it's unclear that his satraps and ministers have an animus against the Jews. But here they just conquered the Babylonian Empire, and someone who had been an advisor to the Babylonian kings and was a stranger, a Jew on top of it, is raised to the highest level, and they resented him. So they concocted this plan that no one can praise or pray to anyone but the king, knowing that Daniel would continue to daven to Hashem, and thereby they'll throw him into the lion's den. But the purpose was primarily a professional jealousy of Daniel, as if it were. There's no indication other than, the general resentment of important people to a foreign interloper. There doesn't seem to be any particular animus against Jews any more than to anyone else who isn't of the ruling nation. So, and of course, the fact that Daniel had predicted the fall of Belshazzar and the fact that he clearly was not of the Babylonians was of a great, I think, influence in Darius and Darius of making him great. But nevertheless, what happens here is he does get in trouble for his worship of Hashem, but that's sort of a subterfuge, a feature that they're using to get rid of him. So there is a difference here, and in general, with the exception of the story of Purim, the Jews, and really throughout the Talmudic period, though there have been periods of oppression, on the whole, the experience of the Jews had been very benign in the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, on the whole, was not harsh to Jews. Now, sometimes it was very corrupt, or very lawless, and the Jews suffered like everyone else, but there's no indication of any particular animus to Jews, again, with the exception of the Purim story. And the reason I bring this up is to demonstrate that the Purim story is an anomalous. In other words, it shouldn't have happened. Jews were not particularly hated in the Persian Empire. Jews were not particularly persecuted in the Persian Empire. There was no history and tradition of hatred of Jews. But nevertheless, in spite of the fact that Jews were integrated into society and the economy, in spite of the fact that no animus towards Jews, Jews are threatened with annihilation in a moment. The point being that one of the ancillary points that you make from Daniel to the story of Purim is that the Jewish people are never secure by the parameters that would normally make anyone else secure, nor are they insecure, like with the Hanukkah story, where they had no chance, nor are they insecure by the parameters that would make anyone else insecure. In other words, the Jewish people do not live according to the rules of history, and in their most secure time, if it is so as Hashem's will, and they are not with Hashem, they can be threatened with annihilation when it's completely irrational and completely not in the nature of that empire. And conversely, we look at the Hanukkah story, it works the other way around also. That there's no way the Jews could have won, they had no chance. It was a hopeless rebellion against the mighty empire, yet they succeeded, even though there was no rational way they could have succeeded. Because the Jews do not run according to the rational rules of history. That's a general observation that we gather from Daniel, where you see that it wasn't Daniel's worship of Hashem per se, nor was it a hatred to the Jewish people, but it rather was a subterfuge where the ministers of the king saw a chance to get rid of this interloper who they were jealous of. And that is where we are up to at the present moment, which I shall now share. So we're basically halfway through. And I'm going to say, so we're up to chapter 6, verse 12. And I am going to place it on the thingy. Share screen, and there we are. Okay. So Odai and Gavraya, then these men, Elech, they went, knowing what they would find. Hirgishu, they searched, Vihishkakhu, and they found the Daniel, this is all in Aramaic, the Daniel Bo'e Umischanein, praying and supplicating Kodem Elokei before his God. Ba'adain, then, by and by, Kirivu, they drew close to the king, the Omrin, and they said, Kadam Malka, in the presence of the king. Al Esar Malka, with regards to the king's prohibition. Hello, Esar Shamta, did you not issue a decree? Again, a decree that the one check on the kings of Persia and Media is that they could not reverse the decree. That any man beg anything from any god, but not should any man to us until for 30 days. Other than you, my king, will be thrown into the pit of the lions.
Rabbi?
That this thing is established as the law for us. Meaning in Persia, the law day that cannot be repealed. In other words, the king agreed that he indeed made such a decree. And again, we see here that Daniel, even though it was a 30-day decree, that Daniel refused to be separated from his relationship to Hashem, even for one day, even for short periods of 30 days. He would not bend at all. Ba'adain, so then, Anu, they raised their voices, and they all together said, Kadamalka, before the king, Aha, the Daniel, this Daniel, the Mibnei Galusa, the Yehud, is from the exile of the Jews. Now, there's an important point over here. You notice this is already 50 or so years after the destruction of the temple, and the Jewish people are still called the Golus of Judea. Why? Because they did not give up their identity, their religion, or even their hope of return. Hence, the exiles from Yehuda, they're yearning to return for Yehuda. They never gave up their hope. Though some Allah, Malka, and it's a general rule that anytime someone is dispossessed of their property but doesn't cease complaining about it, doesn't cease claiming it, that the property does not move by eminent domain away from them. By the same token, that whenever the Jews have been in Golus, they've always said, we are the exile from Judea. We're in exile from the land of Israel. And we continue to claim it and to yearn for it. So since it was our land, and among other things, we never gave up our claim to it, so even according to the most basic legal principles, it remains the property of the Jewish people. V'zimnin telasa yoma boy b'usei, and 3 times a day, that this lo yisamalach, he doesn't pay any attention, O king, to aim to your decree and your prohibition that you decreed. And 3 times a day, not only once a day does he break your decree, 3 times a day he prays. Ad Yain Malka, when the king heard the thing, Shagi be'esh aloi, he became ba'ash, his spirit became very upset. V'al Daniel Shem bol l'shezula, v'admole shimshav mishtadel etzelusa. He tried to save him. He told him, I don't believe you, and he went to Daniel and until sunset. But the problem was that came sunset. Daniel, the king is begging Daniel, look, let me save you. Daniel says, no, I'm going to pray. Let be what's going to be. Because Daniel understands that this is ultimately an attempt, what he was a public figure. The rule is that when someone asks you to break Judaism in the presence of 10 Jews, so even if it's not idol worship, forbidden relationships, or murder, you have to give your life. Since Daniel was the commentaries who deal with the halachic aspects of this explain that since Daniel was a public figure, any compromise in Judaism was a chilul Hashem, a profanation of Hashem's name, and he was obliged to give his life for anything in Judaism, because it was a public attempt to get him to abandon his Judaism. And this is a case where the purpose wasn't the negation of Judaism. Nevertheless, if someone threatens you with death to publicly negate any part of Judaism, and it's in the presence of 10 Jews, let alone the whole Jewish people, you have to give your life. So this is really in line with the halachic premises. Ba'dein Malka, so he tried to save him, but came Sunday, the men gathered, and they said, stop stalling, Mr. King. You should know, O king, that the law of Persia Media is that any prohibition the king makes cannot be changed. In other words, you can't change it yourself. This is our one privilege against the absolute rule of the kings, and we insist you follow it, or you're going to have a revolution. Ba'dein Malka Omar, so the king called Daniel, and they brought Daniel and they threw him into the pit of the lions. May the God who you pray to constantly save you. In other words, the king was very distressed, and he told Daniel, may your God save you. They took a big stone, Pam Guba, and was placed on the mouth of the den. V'chasma Malka be'izkasei, and the king sealed it with the signet ring, and the izkas Ravunoi, and the signet ring of his dignitaries to demonstrate that he himself wouldn't come and remove it, that his will with Daniel should not be altered. So Rashi says over here that the king put a stone there. Why? Because he was worried that if Daniel was saved from the lions, his courtiers, who we clearly saw now, hated Daniel, would try to harm him. So he sealed the pit so that if Hashem desires to save Daniel from the lions, no one should get in the way. And he went to sleep while he was fasting, and the table was not brought to him. And he couldn't sleep. He felt very, very bad about this. So, in other words, he refused to eat. He was very distressed. He loved Daniel. The king got up at the first light of morning, even though kings usually stay in bed till a quarter of the day has passed. He got up in Naga at the first light of morning, at the dawn, the first rays of dawn. And with great haste, with great confusion, Laguba Dayavyasa Azali went running to the pit of the lions. He was very, very concerned. When he came to Daniel's pit, he called to Daniel Bakol Atziv in a very sad voice. He called to the king and said, Daniel, Aveda Loka, Chaya, you who serve the living God, the king who you worship regularly, was he able to save you from the lions? This is actually a very interesting statement on the part of the king. In other words, the king understands that there is a God who's very great, who maybe created the heavens and the earth, but many people believe that once God created the universe, he wound up the clock and walked away. In other words, that even though Hashem is great and the creator of the universe and worthy of praying to, the laws of nature cannot be annulled. They cannot be changed. Once they're set up, they can't be changed because God is not actively involved in the world. So he says, could your God save you? Does your God involve himself in the world? Can your God transcend the order of nature? Is he himself bound by it? Then Daniel spoke with the king, and he said, may the king live forever. Long live the king, speaks Daniel. Hashem sent his angel, and closed the mouth of the lions. They did not harm me at all. Because a merit was found before me before Hashem. Also you, O king, I've done no harm. In other words, Hashem saved me because I didn't harm anyone, nor did I harm you. My davening, my prayer didn't harm you. I've done nothing wrong against you that you have a reason to kill me. Padain Malka Shagi, the king was very happy. Tav Eloi, he felt very good because Daniel was alive and he didn't have his guilt on his hand. And besides, the decree was he should be thrown into the pit of the lions. It wasn't the decree that he should be killed. It was they should be thrown into the pit of the lions. He was thrown into the pit of the lions. Well, Daniel Amar Lahansakam in Guba, he was lifted out of the pit. L'chol chaval, there was no scratch on him, no injury, because he believed in Hashem. In other words, there was absolutely no harm. In other words, and the Amar Malka and the king said, "V'hisiv Guvraya," and he ordered the men, Ilech da'achalu kortziyu de Daniel, who informed on Daniel. He says, "I'm the king. I can throw you in the lion's pit." And Luguv, so they threw him into the lion's pit. Inun them b'nehon, their sons, Unasheon and their wives, because the Persians were pretty tough. The Persians were not shy about what they did to their enemies. So they took, that might not have been Daniel's idea, them, their wives, their sons, Guba, and they didn't even reach the bottom of the pit, until the lions overwhelmed them, because the lions are very hungry. They hadn't been fed for a long time in the hope of Daniel being eaten by them. And so as soon as they were thrown in, the lions were so hungry, the lions overwhelmed them, ate them up, and even crushed their bones into powder. And so it wasn't that the lions weren't hungry, it's that indeed Hashem. Now, the Zohar says, so the simple meaning of the text is that Hashem did a miracle and closed the mouth of the lions. The Zohar says that the idea of Hashem sending his angel is really Daniel himself. In other words, that a person that Hashem told Adam that all the animals will fear you. And it's only because that Adam sinned that people are attacked by animals. But someone who's truly righteous, who has the image of Hashem upon them, an animal will not attack them. So according to the Zohar, Daniel's salvation was a normal result, that anyone who truly has the image of Hashem upon them, who's truly perfectly righteous, no wild animal will attack them. That's what the Zohar says. Ba'adein at that time, so now Daryavesh writes and insists on that no one should get ideas. He insists on absolute freedom of the Jews to live as Jews. Because, he lived in a kingdom with many gods, many people worship the king, many zealous Persian officials, for political reasons, might want to make the Jews worship their idols, and therefore, Ba'adein at that time, Daryavesh the king, Kesav wrote L'chol Amamaya to all the nations, Umaya Velishna, all the nations, peoples, and languages that lived in the whole world. In other words, in all his territory. Shalem Chon Yishke, may your peace increase. Min Kadamai Sim Ta'am, from me comes an order. Di B'chol Shutan Malchusei, in my kingdom. Leon Zoyin with the Chalan min Kodem Eloha Daniel. Let everyone quake and be awestricken before Daniel's God. Tu Elochai V'Kayim. He is the God who exists forever. Umalchusa de L'Schabel. His kingdom will not be destroyed. V'Shultani Atzofe, in his rule till the end of time. Meishiv Umatzel V'Aved Asfim B'Simon. He does wondrous things. V'Shemaya V'Ara in heaven and earth. Tisheziv Daniel Min Yadar Vasi saved Daniel from the hands of the lions. And of course, that meant that anyone who wanted to worship the God of Israel, whether Jew or non-Jew, was able to do so. Daniel was successful in the kingship of Darius, which Rashi says quotes Josephus that he only ruled for a year, and in the kingdom of Cyrus the Persian. Now we need to know a few things about Cyrus as we continue with the historical element here. The Medians and Persians made an alliance, created a great empire, and conquered the Babylonian Empire. The rule was that they alternated kings. So Darius was a Mede and Koresh was a Persian, and so on. They alternated kings from these two major nations. And after Darius came Cyrus, who gave the order to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, and the Jews returned to the land of Israel 54 years after the destruction, began building it. Then people came and informed against the Jews, and Cyrus stopped the building of the temple. Then he died, and throughout the rule of Achashverosh, he refused to let them build the temple. When Achashverosh died, his son, who was the next Darius, which by then the Persians and Medes is sort of merged, so we don't see there's two separate kingdoms. So that Darius gave orders to rebuild the temple, and 70 years after the destruction of the temple, it was rebuilt, and the Second Commonwealth began properly. So Cyrus is the second king after the fall of Babylon. And because Daryavesh died in battle early, relatively young, Daniel also served the Persian Empire as an advisor during the time of Koresh, of Cyrus. Which brings us to the Purim story. According to the Medrash Hasach, who Esther sends to Mordechai, is Daniel. So that Daniel lives into the Purim story, but perhaps is a very old man who didn't survive the story. Those are the basic historical elements over here. So now we're about the year 400 or so before the Common Era. Now we have very, very little anymore about Daniel's history. We know he's a ruler. We know he's a prime minister. We know that he serves during Koresh's time. After Koresh, we don't know anything. We don't have a specific time of his death. The rest of the book, the next half of the book, the next 6 chapters, are all Daniel's visions. And some of these visions go very far into the future, not with very little detail, as his first vision of the figure made up of 4 materials, but going far into the future with a lot of different aspects to these visions, which according to the commentaries go very far into the future. And until now, we've been talking about the interpretation of the dreams of the Babylonian kings. During this same time period that he was interpreting their dreams, he had his own prophetic dreams that he wrote down, and that became the substance, the words of this second book of Daniel. Again, they came with divine inspiration, not as high a level of revelation as Nebuah, but the visions are specifically divine visions that Hashem gave him. In other words, they represent prophecy, just perhaps of a lower order. And that is where we are up to at this point in chapter 7. A few points about the Lion's Den episode. Now, Rabbi Saadia Gaon says a very interesting thing. We know that everything physical has a spiritual source. So in the vision of Yechezkel, he sees the divine chariot, which is a description of the spiritual worlds that are the source of this world. And there is Pnei Aryeh, the vision of the face of a lion. In other words, the physical lion in this world, like all other creatures, has its spiritual source in these beings. Even though a lion is an unkosher animal, it has its source in these angelic beings, these spiritual beings that exist in the Merkava, in the higher spiritual realms. So it says that the Rav Saadia Gaon, who wrote in the 9th century, writes that the supernal Aryeh, in other words, the angel who is the face of the lion, in other words, the source of all the wild animals in this world, that angel, as if it were, spoke to the lions. In other words, gave a message to the lions that this being is the source of all of them, not to touch Daniel. And again, this relates a little bit to the Zohar, says that spiritually speaking, this was sort of inedible, that the very spiritual source of the lions caused that they not, because everything is dependent on its spiritual source. Creation is an ongoing process. So since the source, as if it were, gave them a message, in other words, that their whole being was vitalized by a being that gave them a message, don't harm Daniel, they're not harm Daniel. It's a very interesting Rabbi Saadia Gaon. So now we go back to the story of Belshazzar. So, in other words, not the story, but during Belshazzar's rule, before the conquest of the Babylonian Empire, before Daniel went to work for the Persians, Daniel had a very great vision, which deals with far in the future. B'Shnas Chada, in the first year of Belshazzar the king, which was a long time before the rest of the story. That, in other words, we're going back in time now. Daniel had a dream. Chazon, he saw a vision, a prophetic vision. While asleep on his bed. He wrote the dream down at Reish Milin Omar, and he says that it told the beginning of things. So Anai Daniel Omar, I saw my vision during the night, but Arbe Ruche Shemai, and the four winds of the heaven, Gichon, were hitting Liyama Rabba, the Great Sea. So the Great Sea, in other words, the Mediterranean, or perhaps even the Atlantic, or the great ocean that surrounds the whole world, all the oceans, normally you have either an east wind, a north wind, a south wind, or a west wind, right? But here, all the winds were blowing against each other, causing a maelstrom, causing an enormous confused typhoon of the sea, that the whole sea was stirred up by wind blowing from all directions. Oh, one second, please. So what happened? And out of this great storm, 4 huge beasts came out of the sea, each one different from the other. He saw 4 mighty, scary beasts. The first was like a lion, and had the wings of an eagle. And I saw that its wings were plucked and it was taken from the world. And it stood on its feet like a man. And he was given an ordinary heart, an ordinary person. In other words, this kingdom became just another country like any other countries. Now, it has like a lion and the wings of an eagle, based solely on ancient iconography. What kingdom is this? I want to show you something.
Is it Mitzrayim?
Show you. I actually saw this myself in the British Museum. I'm going to do a share screen. What do you see? You see the body of a lion with the face of a king and the wings of an eagle. This is a Babylonian statue. This is a Babylonian king statue. So the Babylonians saw themselves in this way, and its wings were plucked. It was thrown to the ground. The Babylonian Empire falls, and Mesopotamia remains just an ordinary place. It does not rise to greatness again. Now we go back to Daniel.
And
So
Rabbi,
that's the first one. It represents the Babylonian Empire.
Rabbi, what is could you please tell me what is the Great Sea?
So the Great Sea, so there's two, that one is the Mediterranean, but the other is, we often talk about the Great Sea that surrounds the whole world. In other words, in biblical parlance, all the oceans are a single Great Sea because they're all connected. So it's either the Mediterranean or all the oceans, because they're all one sea. They're all connected.
So they are called Gadol Yam or
Yam Gadol, the Great Sea, is either the Mediterranean, which is the biggest sea they knew, that was close to them, or it's the Okeanos, the ocean, the sea that surrounds the whole world, which is all the oceans basically together.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and we say this is in particular the idea of Nebuchadnezzar. It looked like a lion, it was very mighty, and like an eagle that flies far to find its prey. And what happened was they fall. There was another lion, similar to another creature that looked like a bear, and it stood to one side, and there were 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. Arouse and eat much meat. In other words, conquer a great deal. So like a bear with the kingdom of Persia, which will reign after Babylon, who eats and drinks like bears and wrapped in flesh like a bear, the Persians, and it stood to one side. In other words, that Persia waits for a year. And there were 3 big ribs in its mouth. In other words, that it's not succeeded in swallowing. It says there were 3 provinces always rebelling against it. And these are the Greek colonies of the Balkans, Greeks proper, and of Asia Minor. Because the Greek colonies of Persia, the Greek subject states of Persia, were constantly rebelling against it. So the Greeks, they would never fully conquer, as we know from history. Others say there are 3 kings, the 3 major kings from Persia: Cyrus, Achashverosh, and Darius, who let them build the Beit HaMikdash. So there are many different interpretations of this, but this bear-like creature is the Persians. Now, there are many, many interpretations. We're just going to go through them and look at more of them later. Now, right, and eat much flesh is because the Persian Empire was very powerful and very powerful, very wealthy. And the next one is But Asar Janah Chazeh Haves, then I saw another one, Va'aro Achrei Kinemar, like a leopard, and V'la Gapin Arba de Ofal Gabe, and had four wings of a bird on its neck, and had four heads, and dominion was given to it. The leopard is very fast, and it had wings. In other words, the leopard is the fastest of the great cats, and cheetah doesn't count because it's small. And the idea was that Alexander of Macedon, this is the Greek Empire, he rose very quickly, conquered much of the world very quickly, died quickly, and then there were four different rulers who split up his kingdom. Four of his generals ruled four parts of the world that he had conquered. So it's very fast, very the greatest conqueror of all, and it also fell apart very quickly. Ba'asadin have a chavis bechezve laila, and the visions of the night. Va'ore cheva reviroa, a fourth beast. Techila veim sane, awesome and dreadful and exceedingly strong. And the Shinan diparzale, it had iron teeth, big iron teeth. Achla umadkut ate and crushed and trampled the rest with its face. And it was different from the beast that came before. It had 10 horns, which means to say that that it would be much more powerful. This is the Roman Empire. It is the biggest. It is the strongest. And the 10 horns are the 10 kings who came before. There are many different interpretations. There's 10 kings or consuls who ruled Rome before the destruction of the temple, 10 great emperors in Rome in general, who count as great emperors, 10 successor empires that come from Rome, because basically all of Europe and much of Asia and Western Asia was ruled by Rome. There's all kinds of interpretations about this, but it's the biggest, the longest lasting, the most powerful. Remember, the Roman Empire was a player for over 1,000 years, from the 8th century BCE until the 5th. So there certainly was a major power from the 6th. So well over 1,000 years, and the Roman Empire extended further than any of these empires and ruled a great amount. So Alexander was the greatest and quickest conqueror, but in terms of long-term lasting, and not only that, the successor kingdoms to the Roman Empire last for a long time, and arguably the whole Western civilization is a offshoot of the Roman Empire. Now let's take a look at now, Sargon says that the trampling is every generation in exile. This is, of course, the Christendom, which arose and persecuted the Jews, right through the Holocaust. So these are the European nations. Now, we'll see, when we learn next week, we'll see that out of the ruins of the Roman Empire rises another great empire, and that is not the Byzantine, which is an extension of the Roman, but rather the great Muslim empires, starting with Muhammad and Omar's empire. And all the commentaries agree that the next thing that happens after this beast is weakened is the rise of Islam. And this goes until the very end of time. In other words, until the coming of Mashiach, there will be a struggle between Islam that supplanted much of the Western power, the power of the Roman Empire, and what is left of the Roman Empire. And we'll deal with that all at length, and many different commentaries on this matter when we learn Ezra's Hashem next week. Before we go, does anyone have any questions about this week's events?
No, thank you.
Okay. So we shall continue. And I wish everyone a very, very good day.
Thank you,
Night.
Rabbi.
Take care.
And,